With Chapter 5 of Deltarune right around the corner, you'd think there'd be a more common consensus on who the Knight is. But it seems that things are more divided than ever. Whether you think the Knight is a grieving mother trying to find her daughter, a lost girl with some sort of secret motive, or even Papyrus, everyone seems to be concerned with who the Knight is. But when I first saw the Knight, I had a different question. What are you? Hello? What is the Knight? No, I mean seriously, what is this thing? This thing doesn't follow the scheme that we've seen of how Lightners change in the Dark World. Chris and Susie change color and get these cool battle outfits. Noelle gets an outfit that shows her ties to the Angel, and Birdly gets turned into Falco from Star Fox. It just seems out of the ordinary that someone entering a Dark World would have their design stripped of identity and instead turned into this thing. And that's when I realized something. Throughout the game, we're constantly told about the dichotomy between light and dark. The light world and the dark world are contrasted throughout the game. The light world feels a lot like our world. People face complex, grounded issues like divorce, insecurity, and the feelings of slowly becoming distant with someone you used to be close with. The light world feels real. And then on the opposite spectrum, you have the dark world, a dreamlike place where anything is possible. You can use magical abilities, witness inanimate objects spring to life, and go on adventures. Anything can be solved as long as you have your friends by your side. And the game makes sure you're aware of this, with Rousey saying the Dark World is just an illusion, and even implying that he isn't real. It's all just a dream that you'll eventually have to wake up from. But despite this division, I can't help but feel like soon enough, this is going to be subverted. We're going to see someone or something that represents a mix of the two. Something in between. Something that holds both the fantastical power of the Dark World and the crushing weight of the Light World's reality. A nightmare that haunts you no matter where you are. A nightmare that can't be escaped. A nightmare that is... It only makes sense. Throughout a game that allows you to escape to a fantastical world where your problems don't have to be so complex, the antagonist that comes to stand in our way is something that shatters the illusion. And the truth is, I don't think the Knight is a Lightner or a Darkner. It's something far worse. But let's get back to that in a minute. First, let's see what Deltarune has to say about nightmares. The first time nightmares are mentioned is actually in Chapter 1 when you beat Jevil, with him telling us that from now on a nightmare will awaken in our hearts, in the shadow of the Knight's hand. And sure enough, in Chapter 2 we get a lot more information on the Knight. We find out that the Knight makes dark fountains by piercing the earth. We find out that dark fountains are made when someone is determined enough. It's also interesting that this is the chapter where both Noelle and Birdly view the Dark World as a dream, and he even extends to the weird route where Noelle calls it a nightmare. And while these facts definitely paint a certain picture, we're mostly left in the dark in Chapter 2 when it comes to the Knight itself. But there is something the average player might not notice at all. It actually mentions both nightmares and alludes to the Knight. When I first saw the Knight, with its drooping arms, for some reason it immediately made me think of Werewire, both of them exhibiting somewhat animalistic behavior. At first I thought Werewire's connection was mostly surface level, but after revisiting its battle dialogue I was genuinely surprised. Werewire is described as being controlled by Queen's Wire, sleepwalking through a nightmare. On its own, that line doesn't mean much. But Chapter 2's entire conflict revolves around Queen trying to force Noelle into becoming something she isn't, either convincing her to create dark fountains like the Knight, or threatening to give her a robot face and control her directly. Suddenly, the imagery around Werewire starts to feel a lot more intentional. It paints this picture of someone trapped inside a nightmare, while being controlled by another force. What makes this even stranger is if you look at the Knight in comparison to the other bosses that give you shadow crystals, they all include the line about the air crackling with freedom. But the Knight doesn't. Considering how deliberately these lines tend to be used, it almost feels like the game is distinguishing the Knight from characters who have found or are seeking freedom. Which makes Werewire even weirder. If this line is so deliberate, then why does Werewire's stronger counterpart, the Werewire, have a line that's almost identical to it, saying the air crackles with fighting spirit? The Werewire is also described as a werewire that absorbed its own wire, taking back control. This could be indicating that the Knight might end up breaking its strings, which is a concept that even Spamton mentions. Speaking of Spamton, he does actually mention something that I think ties in with all this nightmare stuff. Alright, I've avoided talking about her up until now, but I think it's finally time to address the antlered elephant in the room. Throughout Deltarune, especially Chapter 2, there are a lot of references to December Holiday. Noelle talks about how Des used to promise to take her to the city. You have the moon that looks like a baseball, which is a reference to Des's connection to baseball bats. The spelling bee incident where somehow the organizers included her name as a word. The Spamton Q&A where he says Des always read his emails. Even the unused dialogue where if you equip the puppet scarf or dealmaker to Noelle, it says this. And of course, most of you are aware by now of the unused dialogue which gets added with every chapter. The dialogue seems to be from someone who's lost in some sort of pitch black void. The common consensus is that this is December Holiday, and honestly I agree, it lines up with the idea that Des is lost somewhere. But the lines of particular interest to me are as follows. I don't eat or drink anymore. I can't tell if I'm awake or dreaming. I can't even tell if I'm dead or alive. It's just nothing but pitch black silence. I always did have that nightmare, walking into the darkness, with the light shining from the doorway, then the door slams behind me, and everything goes black. Is this that nightmare, or was everything else a dream? This paints a pretty interesting picture, that wherever Des is lost, she's stuck in some sort of dreamlike state where she can't tell if she's awake or asleep, which makes me think of a blending between light and dark. It's also important to note that the unused dialogue uses the Dark World text box, which may allude to her location being a Dark World or somewhere adjacent. However, if this is where Des is, what is her connection to the night? Surely Des can't be the night if she's stuck in some sort of darkness coma, right? Well, to explain my position on this, allow me to step away from Deltarune for a moment and talk about another game that Toby Fox has referenced. In 1993, Nintendo released a game called The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, where Link, shipwrecked on the mysterious Koholint Island, must collect 8 magical instruments to awaken the sleeping windfish and escape the island. Toby Fox used a line directly from this game on deltarune.com/rom in the lead up to Chapter 3 and 4, the line being, "You can never defeat us, let's rumble." The line is actually part of a bigger quote said by the main antagonist of Link's Awakening, known as the Shadow Nightmares. The line reads, "We were born of nightmares to take over this world, and we made the windfish sleep endlessly. If the windfish doesn't wake up, this island will never disappear. We would have been the masters of this place, but you had to come here and disrupt our plans." And after defeating the Shadow Nightmares and awakening the windfish, the island disappears, revealing that its existence was the dream of the windfish. And this is where I can finally tell you what I think the night is. I believe that the night is much like Koholint Island. It's a being that is the manifestation of the nightmare that Des is trapped in. And this explains why the night is seemingly able to act intelligently. The night does think and feel, but it's a twisted memory, a nightmare haunting Chris, a nightmare that resembles a lost friend. It might even have her memories and know personal things about Chris, which ultimately ties back to Chapter 2 and the Queen parallels we discussed earlier. It's not a new idea to say that Queen likely is meant to parallel Carol Holiday and her attitudes towards Noelle. But I'd even go as far to say that Queen's plan to make a new night are meant to tell us that Carol Holiday herself may have been involved in Des's night connection. It's entirely possible that Queen doing all of this while being ignorant of the roaring may also tell us that Carol had part in doing this to her own daughter, without knowing the full consequences, or at least doing it in the hopes of something positive. Now that we've established who and what the night is, I think it'd be pretty useful to take a look at what some of the other characters seem to think about the night, to see what the game is saying about them. Chris and Rousey are kind of out of the picture here, since Chris doesn't seem to want to divulge any information due to their secret plan, and Rousey has consistently left out details when it comes to certain things. Which leaves us with Susie. And after reading everything Susie says about the night, all I can really say is Susie is wrong about the night. A Toby Fox classic is setting up certain information to then subvert it at a later time. I think Susie, as someone who isn't in the know when it comes to the night, is being set up with certain beliefs just to have them flipped later on. There are some specific instances that I think are gonna get subverted later on. Firstly, when Gerson asks Susie about what she thinks the night is, she says they're probably a lightener who just wants to see the world burn. The way Gerson poses this question is really interesting. I don't particularly know if Gerson has special knowledge, but it makes me wonder why he would ask what they are and not who they are. Gerson's existence itself already demonstrates that the line between a lightener and a darkener isn't as clear as we think. I think it's also fairly likely that the Knight's motivation isn't simply to see the world burn, as we know they have some sort of plan with Chris. And the second instance is when Susie confronts the Knight, claiming that if they weren't in the Dark World, they'd lose, and the Knight simply laughs, which I think is due to the irony that if they were in the Light World, the Knight would look exactly the same, while Susie wouldn't have access to her Dark World abilities. There's also the fact that the Knight was able to fly undyed into the shelter in such a short amount of time, as well as Asgore having a black shard in the Light World, which at the very least implies the Knight's armor wouldn't change. So I think overall it's safe to say that Susie's expectations of the Knight are going to be challenged. As for the physical attributes, or the nature of the Knight, there's also these two lines from chapter 3 and 4. A pity, it was just repeating all it knew, but you could still hear the sound of the ocean. And so wept the fallen star, making rivers with its tears. Then slowly from the bitter water something grew. It looked like glass. To me, this reads as the nightmare that is the Knight being formed from Dess's pain and fear, ultimately forming a twisted version of her, with the repeating all it knew, meaning the Knight does in fact share Dess's memories to some extent. This makes me feel like there's a real possibility that either Chris doesn't know that the Knight isn't literally Dess, or that Chris is being blackmailed somehow into helping the Knight due to some promise that was made. That's the gist of the proof I was hoping to share for this theory, but there are a few things that I wasn't able to fit in properly that I think are worth noting. The ROM page that I mentioned earlier was mainly hinting at the Iram fight. This fight is a direct reference to the Shadow Nightmares from Link's Awakening, and it also allows us to acquire the Shadow Mantle, which makes the Knight fight actually winnable. I certainly think Iram also has some connections to nightmares. Obviously its name is Mare backwards, and it seems to have some strange knowledge regarding Chris's psyche, but I think that's a topic for an entirely different video. For a reason I'm not entirely sure of, if you interact with Toriel after defeating the Knight, it says she's having a nightmare. This dialogue only appears if you win the fight, and I wasn't able to pinpoint an exact reason for this, so I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. A plausible explanation is that beating the Knight is somewhat a divergence of the prophecy. It also ties back to the Mantle game being the original game where you decide what to do. Now that I've presented my case for this theory, I'd like to take some time to explain what I think this will mean for the story going forward. Deltarune has a lot of characters that are attached to the past. Asgore clinging on to restoring what he's lost, Carol and the way she reacted with the guitar, and especially Noelle with her attachment to her past friendship with Chris and her loss of Dess. What it seems like to me is that the Knight is emblematic of the past too, but maybe not the good parts. The Knight's presence as a nightmare, especially for Chris, seems to remind them of the painful past that they wish they could forget. The loss of Dess, a promise, maybe even the bad attributes that Dess had. The Knight seems to be a twisted manifestation of these things, and if you really think about it, Dess's disappearance is the event that haunts the town. Asgore lost his wife and job, the holidays and dreamers grew distant, and Chris lost someone that they seemingly truly related to. Whatever plan the Knight has Chris involved in, it really seems to be relying on whatever promise Chris made. Whatever ghastly stuff happened to Dess that led her to where she is now, it's entirely possible that Chris feels somewhat responsible. And on the other hand, if Dess is trapped in this nightmare, her agency has been taken away from her, feeding into the idea that our choices don't matter. Her will and memories being forced into this role of the Knight. And it really just seems like things are dire no matter where you go. You can't escape from the past. You can't escape who the world says you are, because our fate is already decided. And eventually, it'll all end with the world being covered in darkness. But what if there was someone who didn't have a past weighing them down? What if there was someone who refused to let anyone decide who they are? Someone whose hope was so strong that it could defy fate itself? What if there was someone who was... While the night is emblematic of the haunting past, Susie is the one who holds the shining future. With Chris haunted by a dark past and Rousey hopeless to the prophetic future, it's Susie who defines who she is here and now, the girl with hope crossed on her heart. Time and time again, we're shown that Susie does things her own way. She carves her own path. I truly believe that by the end of Deltarune, Susie isn't going to defeat the night. She's going to save it, allow it to break its own chains. The whole town weighed down by memories of the past and unable to move on. Susie's the wild card who I think will unshackle the town from their bad memories and defy the prophecy. And that's the Nightmare Night theory. I seriously appreciate you taking the time to watch this. It's something that's been on my mind for a while now, and I imagine I'll revisit the idea after Chapter 5. Let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts or things I missed. Thanks for watching.